paper, Deleuze and Guattari took a more explicit role, and here they take a more implicit role. And as a whole, Peterson from the alt-right. So many on the left have linked Peterson to the alt-right, but I argue this compartmentalization of the right is lazy and dangerous. The reason it's dangerous is because we position Peterson with the alt-right, we miss some of what makes each camp dangerous in its own right. By thinking them separately, it would allow us to take account of two different dangers that present in their twin reactions to neoliberalism. So I'll start by delving into the philosophical framework within which I'm speaking. Then I'll look directly at how Peterson operates on the pole of order or totalitarianism. Following this, I'll examine the alt-right and the way that they work on the pole of chaos or fascism. And finally, I'll briefly conclude by putting forward two possible methods of fighting back against these forces simultaneously. So I want to start with Spinoza. Starting with Spinoza can give us an adequate understanding of how I'm understanding the concept of desire from Deleuze and Guattari as a field. Now, for Spinoza, every mode, or we might say everything or every body, has an essence. But for Spinoza, this essence is a little different from other theories of essence. For Spinoza, the essence of a mode is a striving for self-preservation. The striving is called the conatus. Now, in principle, a thing whose essence is the conatus, or striving to preserve itself, cannot destroy itself. This makes sense. If something is trying to preserve itself, it wouldn't destroy itself. Thus, for Spinoza, a mode can only be destroyed by something external to it, something outside of it. Yet, we see that all sorts of things have destructive tendencies, where one does something that persists in destroying them. How can this come about if one's essence is to self-preserve? Well, in a similar manner, they must have been affected by something outside of themselves. An obvious example would be something like addiction. Let's say that Jane is addicted to cigarettes. Her desire must have been affected by something or someone outside of herself to create this desire for cigarettes. We can think of any number of reasons, number of scenarios that might have led Jane to become addicted to cigarettes. Maybe she was stressed out about her parents' divorce and wanted to rebel, and her friend Aaron offered her a cigarette. The cigarettes helped with the stress and made her feel rebellious, so she kept smoking. Over time, the cigarette shaped her physiology to desire them. Thus, her internal composition was affected in such a way that she came to desire things that were contrary to her conatus. We can already see in this picture that desire does not take place in a vacuum via one-on-one relationships, but is a plane of interacting and intersecting tendencies. For Nietzsche, this is a field of asignifying forces. It is the pole of Dionysius. Deleuze and Guattari will call this a smooth space, or perhaps a body without organs. It is a field of desire. I like how Franco Bifo Berardi describes this in The Soul of Work. He says, it is a field where an intense struggle takes place, or better, an entangled network of different and conflicting forces. This is what Peterson might call chaos. Chaos is always in flux, it is violent, it subverts. On the other hand, this chaos or desire can become more rigid. There are different ways to think about this. In Nietzsche, the will to power becomes crystallized in the will to knowledge. In Deleuze and Guattari, the flows of the smooth space may become more rigid or striated. Ultimately, what is happening is that the chaotic nature of desire is being repressed in some way and forced into a dogmatic totalitarian structure of rigidity or striation. This is what Nietzsche might call the pole of Apollo, what Deleuze and Guattari might call a striated space, or what Peterson might call order. Order is the crystallization of a particular flow, which is then blocked from becoming new. It promotes a standard order of things that is kept the same. This occurs for Deleuze and Guattari because of a repressed desire. So we have two poles. To use Peterson's language, they are chaos and order. Order crystallizes pathways by repressing chaos, and chaos is constantly disrupting and undermining order. So I've situated Peterson within a field of theorists who I tend to agree with. One area where he diverges is in his presentation of order and chaos as gendered. Nevertheless, I want to talk about this for a moment because I think it allows us to situate a fundamental difference between Peterson and the alt-right. For Peterson, order is masculine and chaos is feminine. Drawing from Greek mythology, if he wants to follow Nietzsche in promoting Apollo as order, He could look at Ares, the female god of chaos, as chaos. The alt-right takes a different viewpoint. In talking about the rebellion of online groups from which the alt-right has sprung, Angela Nagel suggests that they are influenced by classic texts such as Rebel Without a Cause and Fight Club, wherein conformity in this imaginary is feminine and rebellion is masculine. There is an inversion of Peterson's matrix. This juxtaposition may provide a key insight to the differences between the two groups. Each prioritizes the embodiment of masculinity in the matrix. So why does Peterson prioritize order, and with it the repression of chaos? Even in his own work, this might seem initially confusing, as he seems to walk along a border between chaos and order, referring to this as the Tao. Contemporary military arsenals can help explain this discrepancy. Peter suggests that, quote, our technologies of destruction have become too powerful, unquote. Again, this is not a point that I disagree with. We can look to Paul Virilio as a leftist who argues similar points. Peterson feels the ability of military technology to decimate the planet. The problem is that Peterson's solution is an outright repression of chaos or change, rather than a more nuanced take. He views liberal democracy as a stable and well-functioning system on the basis of its individualism. His steadfast devotion to the stability leads him to defend against any agent of chaos who might disrupt or undermine the stability. We can see an example of this in his promotion of liberal art hierarchies, which he calls functional hierarchies of competence. Within these individualistic hierarchies, each person takes on the burden of being, which demands we traverse a heroic path. This narrative of marketplace economics and individualism provides stability against the violent theories of fascism and communism. He cites the millions killed in the name of these ideologies as evidence of their violence. Yet rather than a purely descriptive or moral analysis, Peterson goes on to prescribe the cause of their violence. These ideologies are violent because they prioritize groups rather than individuals. While the liberal individual can be held accountable for their action, the group is much more difficult to hold accountable for Peterson. Furthermore, again, as we have seen in the 21st century with weapons of mass destruction, the potential for violence has been exacerbated, deeming fascism and communism or any group politics too dangerous to allow. Any opening to chaos allows an opening for total destruction. Thus, for Peterson, it is safer to remain in our contemporary narrative of liberal individualism than to allow chaos to grow out of control. Thus, I would argue, Peterson is really no different than any classical conservative. He just happens to want to conserve liberalism. He views any change to the status quo as an affront to that stability and a potential opening to the mass destruction of military technologies. It might be argued from his perspective, though I'm not aware of him explicitly making this argument, that the violence that does exist in the society is a necessary evil for the stability it provides. Peterson, like his pal Pinker, might say that liberalism is the best society humans have ever come up with. Whether or not that is true, it doesn't mean that we can't determine something better. The leftist Nietzschean approach taken by Deleuze and Guattari draws upon the chaotic pole in order to upend or change society for the better. If we look to the women's liberation movement, for instance, we can see that it drew upon the chaotic pole to disrupt the patriarchal hegemony that was oppressive to women. Women's liberation was invigorated with the field of desire, allowing for disruption and subversion of order and rigidity. Deleuze and Guattari are more dialectic here than they might want to be, suggesting a mediation between the two poles resulting in a movement towards liberation. In his defense of the status quo, Peterson wishes to impede or repress desire and chaos, in this sense, from producing new changes. But it would be a mistake to suggest the opposite of order and repression and chaos and desire should be taken as a solution for our resistance. As Berardi suggests, desire is not a good boy, nor the positive force of history. Desire is the psychological field where imaginary flows, ideologies, and economic interests are constantly clashing. Desire doesn't work in a singular direction. It disrupts everything. I want to draw upon the theoretical thinkers in the alt-right, as well as the praxis of the alt-right, to show that both work on the chaotic pole to disrupt and disturb the orderly pole. We can start with Alexander Dugin. Dugin's work suggests liberalism's rise to hegemony occurred simultaneous with the abolishment of the political. Liberalism is no longer a political theory, but a lifestyle. Now this account is not so different from someone like Mark Fisher's account of capitalist realism. though it posits liberalism alone and not a synthesis of liberalism and capitalism as the hegemonic element that must be overcome. Duggan's work has been highly influential on the European right, influencing fascist movements such as the Golden Dawn and the Russian neo-Nazis. In The Dark Enlightenment, Nick Land critiques the very status quo that Peterson defends. I quote at length, quote, "It is considered simply obvious that cities have bad areas that are not merely impoverished, but lethally menacing to outsiders and residents alike. Visitors are warned to stay away, whilst locals do their best to transform their homes into fortresses, avoid venturing into the streets after dark, and especially if young and male, turn to criminal gangs for protection, which further degrades the security of everybody else." Now, unlike Peterson, Land is a right-wing thinker who favors the Dionysian pole. Like Duggan, he believes liberalism to be the primary factor in the production of these horrors. Drawing upon the chaotic pole, he desires a disruption of the status quo, which he views as an autopoietic system perpetuating its own and planetary destruction. His futurology is transhumanist, envisioning a world where the human is subsumed into the technosphere through a bionic horizon, fundamentally shifting the physiology of the human. Mencius Moldbug, another prominent right-wing thinker in a similar vein, hopes to produce a novel fascism which he deems a high-tech new structure. He develops the idea of the antiversity, an alternative to the university which serves as the basis of an alternative intellectual thought which undermines the hegemony of the university or the cathedral. This would allow for the formation of a new political party, the Plinth, with the purpose of developing a coalition against liberal norms, against the very liberal norms Peterson wishes to defend. The Plinth hopes to disrupt and overtake culture of the hegemony, allowing the fulfillment of a fascist coup with the support of the people. Now, the chaotic pole is primary for the praxis-oriented elements of the alt-right as well. Despite its flaws, Nagel's controversial book, Kill All Normies, does an exemplary job of showing how the alt-right operates via a leaderless, anarchic network. In this way, it operates closer to a smooth space of free desire than a striated space of repressed desire. As an anarchic network, the alt-right has a freedom to disrupt and destroy that isn't possible within a hierarchical network. It can operate using asymmetrical warfare that allows it to stay hidden within a network model. The asymmetry is most prominent through trolling efforts. As Nagel suggests, quote, "The alt-right seeks to destroy more than it proposes to build. Unlike the institution building and tradition preserving ethos of the Burkean conservative movement, and seeks to smash some of its most treasured parts of US conservatism," unquote. Peterson himself is not immune to these attacks, with numerous commentators on his videos suggesting he is synonymous with social justice workers and claiming that he has been influenced by the Jews. Beyond mere trolling, the chaotic pole has produced physical violence as well. A recent report by the Anti-Defamation League found that the majority of extremist murders in 2017 were committed by right-wing extremists. These findings are undoubtedly limited due to the difficulty in determining who constitutes a right-wing extremist, but they do suggest a growth in right-wing violence. Most prominent of these murders is that of Heather Heyer, who was run over by a car while protesting the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia. This tragedy actualized a classic right-wing meme, which joked about driving into protesters. Furthermore, if we are willing to take Nagel's claim that involuntary celibates or incels should be tied to the alt-right as well, we can include the van attack from last April in Toronto as an example of this violence. So I've spoken at length about the chaotic violence in the alt-right in order to differentiate it from the violence of Peterson. Peterson's violence is the violence of the Apollyon pole. Peterson wants to keep things from spiraling out of control by repressing chaos and desire. In a sense, the alt-right is the very sort of thing his repression attempts to block from occurring. At the other pole, we see the chaotic flux of the alt-right. Their violence is one of intense destructive change. Their trolling and physical violence is centered around a desire that has been free to disrupt and destruct. What I hope to show is that there is violence on both sides and that we must be wary of. I believe that Deleuze and Guattari do an excellent job of diagnosing the situation in 1,000 Plateaus. In the plateau micropolitics and segmentarity, they suggest a distinction between totalitarianism and fascism. Quote, "A bizarre remark by Virilio puts us on the trail. In fascism, the state is far less totalitarian than it is suicidal. There is in fascism a realized nihilism. Unlike the totalitarian state, which does its utmost to seal all possible lines of flight, fascism is constructed on an intense line of flight, which transforms into a line of pure destruction and abolition. Unquote. Under this metric, Peterson's order is totalitarian. It hopes to block any lines of flight from producing change. The alt-right's chaos is the fascistic pole. It is a line of pure destruction. In their earlier work, Deleuze and Guattari attempt to escape the repression of Freud's Oedipal triangulation through the freeing of desire. Yet, in 1,000 Plateaus, we come to realize that freeing desire comes with its own dangers, dangers that may be more dangerous than leaving things created for the time being. The reason we must be cautious in all of this is that the most obvious way of combating Peterson through the freeing of chaos and desire holds with it all of the dangers of the alt-right. On the other flank, attempting to combat the alt-right using a strategy of blockage and repression leads back to the camp of Peterson. Thus, we are Homer Simpson stuck between the rock of fascism and the hard place of totalitarianism. There are possible solutions available to us. While a full analysis of these solutions outside the scope of this paper, I would like to offer them now as possible areas of future scholarship. Both of these solutions are fundamentally Nietzschean insofar as Nietzsche attempts to escape the dialectic of Apollo and Dionysius. The first comes via Deleuze and Guattari, who I've drawn on throughout my thinking of this project. In 1,000 Plateaus, they offer the concept of the middle. Working from the middle requires a recognition that we never start from the beginning, but that we start from within the problem. Working from the middle space is not a centrism, but an exploratory revolutionary project. We realize that we are in a space of danger, that against the dangers of the alt-right, it may be better to remain striated or orderly for a while. But within this striation, we can experiment. Deleuze and Guattari suggest that we experiment by sending out what they call probe heads. These probes try small revolutionary acts to see what is effective at disrupting the orderly, while not falling into the tendencies of the alt-right's destruction. It is thus a cautious attempt to draw upon chaos, while not being fully subsumed by that chaos, drawing upon desire, while not allowing it to become destructive or suicidal desire. A second solution, which I've been thinking about more recently, comes from Deleuze and Guattari's contemporary Francois Laurel. Laurel would hold that Deleuze and Guattari do not remove themselves far enough from the solution given. Instead, Laurel attempts to think the Dionysian and Apollonean poles not through mediation, but through withdrawal. For Laurel, the solution would be to remove the decision entirely, as the decision itself is problematic. This might be to say that any attempt to decide between chaos and order is already working on the plane of order, or the transcendental plane. These are identities that are always already mediated. Thus, by even allowing ourselves to decide, we've been pulled into a game we don't want to play. Just to summarize and conclude, this presentation has attempted to distinguish Jordan Peterson from the alt-right. This distinction is made not in order to absolve Peterson of any wrongdoing, rather as an attempt to show that there is not a simplistic solution to either Peterson or the alt-right, and that positioning them as synonymous does a disservice not to Peterson or the alt-right, but to any left-wing position that is actually attempting to overcome either. Resistance needs to start with the realization of their distinction and can only work from there.
Thank you. And we can have questions here.
Yeah.
So this approach of starting from the middle, or the example of sending out probes.
Yeah.
Okay, what does that look like? Can you give an example of that?
So it's to say that we don't just instantly go headlong into a solution, but that we experiment with the solution to see if it works, and if it works, then we can continue doing that. So a solution might be, so you might, it's the testing out of different protest methods or something. So if you want to protest an alt-right thinker, you might try a certain way of protesting that alt-right thinker. And if it works, then keep doing it. And when it stops working, you stop doing it using some other tactic. So you could use something with, like the black bloc. If it's effective, you can put out. It's almost an operationalization of tactics. So you put forward some metric for determining whether your tactic is effective, and you test it out with a small scale attempt, and if it works, then you would continue doing it until it stops working, I guess. Yeah.
So it sounds like similar, like from my angle and what I've been working on, sounds to me a lot like what you could call an opening to contingency.
Okay.
That like rather than sort of making laws and saying, well, this is the way to have a revolutionary movement, it's sort of like letting yourself read the situation and like trying to like jump into like the key moment. I like to conceive of this through ancient Greek rhetoric, and also to an extent Heidegger's reception of that and the concept of the kairos, which is like a time of like intervention rather than like linear time. So like it sort of sounds to me like what you're advocating is very like chirological. How would?
Yeah. So Jaden Adams has a book called Occupy Time, and it's really working within that sort of register, because they draw upon the distinction between time and think about contemporary struggle in light of that. So one of their thesis in that book is that it's drawing upon Berlioz, and Berlioz suggests that in the contemporary, everything is sped up, everything is very quick, and so whereas in the past you could use a strategy for quite a long time and it would be effective, now with mass communication, everything is a lot quicker. So something like Occupy, it worked for a moment, but then it didn't work anymore, and so you had to move on to something else. And I think that's exactly what I'm sort of positing is that having a single normative dogmatic method of resistance doesn't work. So we have to struggle for figuring out what works and use it as long as it works. And when it stops working, you have to move on to something else.
Cool.
Yeah.
So I was thinking about the framework in which you set up the comparison, and I agree with most of it, particularly the point you made about the various strains of the alt-right being opposed to liberalism more fundamentally than anything like Peterson. But I was also thinking about a critique I had of Pasolini, and it comes up at the end of your thing. Pasolini also said the real anarchists were fascists because they were free from all desire. The issue that I have is when you deal with actual fascist governments, they work in coalitions with authoritarians. So understanding the tendency to both separate Peterson from the alt-right is, I think, vital, and I'm glad you're doing it in the framework that you're doing it. But I also think we do have to look at why it would be natural to assume that they are related, because in historical fact, usually those kinds of totalitarian conservatives or Burkean conservatives end up siding with fascists, at least as a tacit capitulation, even when the fascists destroy them.
Yeah, I think that's legitimate. There's definitely a totalitarian element to fascism, for sure. I think well, I'm drawing upon Deleuze and Guattari, and they make a distinction between a macro-fascism and a micro-fascism.
Okay.
And a macro-fascism would be more of a totalitarian sort of fascism, and it does work upon the planes of desire. And so fascism, as I used it, I probably should have explained this, but it's more of a fascism of desire than it is a sort of totalitarian fascism. So when they bring up this concept of microfascism, they do it in terms of what they call the minimal state of anarcho-capitalism. So they suggest that sort of like this edible repression is always taken as the danger. We're always very afraid of the the left is always afraid of like the dogmatic totalitarianism. It's always about stripping the power from the sovereign. But that what they fear is this sort of suicidal state of the minimal the minimal state of anarcho-capitalism is what they call it. And that's what they think is just this free desire of pure destruction, where destruction becomes the only element worth pursuing. And I tend to think that Nick Land is sort of the embodiment of that. And I think I could see Peterson siding with many parts of the alt-right. I would really struggle to see him standing side by side with somebody like Land, who so fundamentally wants to dismember any understanding of the human physiology that we currently have.
I guess the follow-up question would be, how, there's a strain of the alt-right that you didn't mention. And it's a strain that I find strategically kind of ignored, even though it's where the name comes from. And that is the radical traditionalist wing.
Okay.
Which Spencer comes out of, and that's where you get the, I mean, it's him and Paul Goffard is where you get the name alt-right. They seem to actually kind of get both poles. And I would argue that probably Dugin does too, if you read some of his critiques of Putin, and not that I suggest you actually do that, but if you were going to, so I guess the question is, does this actually explain all that we encounter when dealing with alt-rightists? I know it explains a lot of the most radical violence, but
Yeah, I don't think at all it explains everything. I'm just trying to, I just see so often, and I had some quotes at the very beginning from news organizations. And I just think it's very lazy to lump these things together, because if you're lumping them together, you miss so much. And I think this is a problem in parts of the left, is that everything they don't like just becomes fascism. And like, that's fine rhetorically within a leftist community, but I think the mistake of lumping everything together in fascism is it misses the nuance of the opposition. And if you miss the nuance of the opposition, you're not going to win. You're not gonna have any strategy in saying that you lumped all together in one concept. Yeah, this is just an attempt to separate, to show that there is a distinction between at least these elements of the alt-right that I've drawn upon, specifically the dark enlightenment, neo-reactionary people, and someone like Peterson. Probably have time for one.
We've got about another minute or two left.
Do you want to say something again?
It's not really a question, it's just a comment. I'm just thinking on that note with regards to whether or not this is like truly encompassing of the whole alt-right or whatnot. It's not, but I do think acknowledging these two poles does not necessarily mean that any member of alt-right or any conservative might exist solely on one pole or the other. I think when we're thinking about molar politics, especially the apparatus after contemporary integrated world capitalism, exists in a space where everything is producing alongside one another. And so we're having all these effective productions which can influence one another, and can have their own sort of segments, but also have direct contact. And I think through that, we sort of start to see how like the market, for example, is like encompassing of systems that are not only purely capitalist systems, but socialist bureaucratic systems also become incorporated into the market. Though they're completely opposed to one another. None of those probably say like, oh, they're opposed to one another, so they can't exist inside the same body, but somehow they are. So they're not truly opposed to each other. And I think that those distinctions don't necessarily mean that they are also producing alongside one another. So.
Okay, thank you very much. Jacob, thank you. That was really illuminating. Thank you for coming. And right now we're going to break down and get ready for our next break. Thank you so much. Bye.